Now, Lord Peter Melchett was a leading environmental campaigner who served as executive director of Greenpeace for 12 years, from 1989 to 2001. He was arrested in 2000 during a protest against genetically modified crops. Peter Melchett's grandfather had made his money building up the chemical company ICI, but the family lost much of its fortune, and Peter was brought up on a farm in North Norfolk. To make ends meet, the house was rented out to holidaymakers, which, as he recalled, meant they had to find alternative accommodation.
We went to live in a flat in a disused control tower in the middle of the airfield where the factory, the making animal feed, which my dad was running, was. And of course, I thought this was amazing, living in a flat in a control tower in an airfield with this huge factory all around.
But this is where you developed your love of the countryside?
Yes, sailing on the North Norfolk coast, an amazing area, wilderness and wildlife.
Lord Melchett's friend and fellow campaigner, Tom Burke.
He was never the kind of hunt and shoot and fish in kind of countryman. He was very much a person connected to nature. His interest in the environment wasn't just wildlife. I mean, indeed, his whole experience in Greenpeace was on the big resource and pollution issues. And in a sense, you could see it starting in an involvement in nature and wildlife from his background. But I think a lot more came into it than simply a kind of nature conservation driver.
When his father died in 1973, Peter became the fourth Lord Melchett. He served as a Labour whip under Harold Wilson and was a junior minister at the Department of the Environment and later in Northern Ireland. I asked Tom Burke if Peter saw his title and position in the House of Lords as a platform for campaigning.
Peter saw changing things through politics as being central, but I don't think he saw inheriting the title as being central to that. He was always very resistant to the idea, and the reason he never married Cass, in part, was that's his partner Cass, was so that he wouldn't pass on the peerage to his children. One of the last things he ever did, actually, in the House of Lords was to vote for the bill to abolish a hereditary peerage.
I got quite disenchanted with politics, I think for two reasons. First of all, the House of Lords has no legitimacy whatsoever. And I also found that the cynicism that many politicians, not all, but I think most, develop because of the constant criticisms and the nature of the life they lead.
So he'd been involved in Greenpeace and then he became its executive director. What sort of state was the organisation in when he took over?
Greenpeace, when Peter took over, was really just getting going. It was a small and not very widely known organisation in Britain. And what Peter really did was take Greenpeace into the big league.
Environmental campaigners from the pressure group Greenpeace have won a High Court ruling against the government over new oil exploration in the North East Atlantic. Greenpeace has been arguing that licences to drill for oil were being granted without taking into account European rules about the protection of wildlife.
He was an extraordinary person who combined really a sort of deep analytical intelligence with a very profound moral clarity. I mean, in a sense, he was a leader, he wasn't a manager, and he led the organisation extremely well. He had a really good sort of political instinct for the pressure point in a campaign.
I'm doing this because this is dangerous contamination of the countryside.
One of the most famous of the campaigns, the one that he's now, I think, most widely remembered for, was the campaign against GM foods.
This is genetic contamination and it's unacceptable.
You're under arrest on suspicion of criminal damage to crops, okay? And with that, you don't have to say anything, but it may hold you.
The executive director of Greenpeace, Lord Melchett, is being held in custody this evening after a magistrate refused him bail over charges arising from the destruction of genetically modified crops in...
They were charged with criminal damage because they ripped up crops, and their defence was they were doing it in the public interest, and they were acquitted.
And presumably he felt vindicated by that, but the campaign goes on, doesn't it? Well, and the controversy still rages.
I think Peter felt vindicated by the rationale behind the campaign, but he did have a tremendously adamantine will, and so he would
have spent time in prison if necessary. If he believed in it.
He was completely up for spending time in prison if that's what had been required for him to pursue the truth.
I would draw the line between non-violence and violence. For me, that's an absolute line, and violence, in my view, I don't believe can be justified.
One of the great things that happened during his reign at Greenpeace was really Greenpeace got way ahead on the use of what was then the new technology, the technology of the day, which was satellite television.
Over here is the Nishin Maru, which is the biggest ship in the Japanese whaling fleet. In between, in the middle, is a Greenpeace inflatable getting hosed down from both sides.
We managed to stop the whaling fleet for more than 14 days, longer than we've ever done before.
He was brilliant at getting Greenpeace to deploy their ability to get pictures onto TV to really give a sort of power to the campaign and reach for the campaign that none of the other campaigning organisations, I think, really grasped.
And he went to the Soil Association.
Yeah.
What were his achievements there?
I think the one that will be remembered was really combining with Jamie Oliver to make the whole issue of school meals into a massive campaign. Now, as always with Peter, there were the things you saw going on in the headlines, and then there was all the other things that Peter was involved in doing. But that was the one that he'll be very widely remembered for. But driving forward the policy to support agriculture that was sustainable. So it was broader than simply organic farming. It was the whole approach to food and farming that created a sustainable future. I think Peter has had an enormous effect, particularly in Britain, but actually in the world as a whole, not just by what he actually did and got accomplished, but also by the kind of example he set.
Tom Burke on Lord Melchett, who's died aged 70.